We return once again to the Gospel of Mark, to the story within the story. This is going to be part 2 of where we began, looking at the miracle now within the miracle, and a lesson so important still for us this very day. Let me ask you a question as we get started. Where do you turn when you're in need? Where do you look for help? Where's the first place you go to seek help? I want you to think about those two questions this afternoon as we get into this lesson. If you remember where we are now in Mark chapter 5, Jesus has returned from Gadara back to Capernaum. He's 2 years into his ministry just to find not a massive crowd arriving to see him, but a massive crowd waiting on him. They didn't leave. They've been watching anxiously for Jesus to return. They've seen too much. They've heard too much. They cannot let it go. And so Jesus returns and he begins back in Capernaum preaching to the multitude when a religious leader approaches him begging him for help for his daughter. In our last study, we were introduced to the man named Jairus and a heartbreaking story of his daughter, 12 years old, at the point of death. Jairus comes to Jesus through these unbelievable crowd, and he asks Jesus for help. If you come with me, she'll live. You can save her life. And he falls to the ground. He's pleading for help. Like Jairus just overran with emotion, but who wouldn't be? But a lot of the amazement in that lesson is really in Jesus' response, because he came to preach. He's in a perfect opportunity to preach. And yet he leaves it all to go with Jairus. He is available to Jairus just as the Lord remains available to all of us. Matthew 14 says that Jesus was moved with compassion. And it gives me hope in my own life to know that my Savior is compassionate towards me. Amen. So clearly in all of this, Jesus sees Jairus' faith. The problem is, and where we're going now with this, there's still a huge crowd to contend with. And so anxiously I imagine Jairus, he's trying to get Jesus to his house, passing through people the best he can in a hurry, because to say time is critical is to say it lightly, and yet an issue is about to arise that's going to slow everything down. Jairus' faith is going to be tested as we look at the miracle within the miracle. Matthew 5, verse 25. Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. Something I want you to notice about this woman as we begin is how much detail is given about her specifically. In fact, there are 7 participial phrases used to describe her in this section, which is one of the most extensive that we have of any person Jesus interacted with. We're told that this woman has a bleeding problem. It's not just a bleeding problem, it's a problem she's had as long as Jairus' daughter has been alive. She's had this problem since Jesus was 20 years old, and he's now 32. 12 years she's been struggling with this. Now, we don't know what caused this, only that it was constant. And to that, we could imagine the problems that would accompany this. Because I want you to see her mindset in all this. She would have obvious weakness in her strength. There would be the danger of death, obviously. But on top of that, on top of the physical, is what was her life like as a Jew dealing with this. In Leviticus 12 and Leviticus 15, a woman is unclean for 7 days after a time of bleeding like this. And that of course, was symbolic of sin. So there's more to that. But that means that this woman has now been unclean for 12 years. And it's a constant situation she's in, which means she could never be clean. That meant she couldn't go to the synagogue. She couldn't go to the temple. If she touched her husband, he would be unclean. If she had kids and she touched them, her kids would be unclean. Friends, strangers, it wouldn't matter. So just imagine what this woman's life was like. She could never get beyond this. So if this is you, what do you do? Well, where would you go in this case? Where would you turn? Well, I assume you'd go to the doctor. That's what she did. In fact, the verse says that she spent all the money that she had to the point she's in poverty now. And oh, by the way, she's still bleeding. It didn't help. In fact, Mark actually says, and she grew worse. I don't imagine that's a message you're going to find on a billboard in Capernaum for any doctor's offices there. Hey, come see us, bring all your money, and we're probably going to make you worse. Now, to be fair, there really wasn't any cure for diseases like that, which there wasn't really any cure for diseases, period, until the late 19th century. I mean, this is still relatively new stuff. That's why up until then, mortality rates were so high. So, I mean, they tried, but they didn't help. That's the essence of this. Now, I did find this kind of funny, whether it's on purpose, which I believe it is or not, that Luke, the physician, leaves this out. He doesn't cover this. He simply says that she was incurable. Not that the doctors tried and failed, which he's a doctor, so. Now, it's interesting to read. If you ever spend time looking at other sources, you'll find some interesting stuff. Like, what would doctors try for this? Like, what would be the medicine to try to heal somebody? They would use toxins to try to draw out sickness. But the Talmud, I actually thought was pretty fascinating. The Talmud said if you're a woman and you're dealing with this, then they have the solution to your problem. What you do is you just need to carry the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen bag and you'll be healed. That's some sound medical advice right there. Now, and listen, if that doesn't work, it's okay. They've got a plan B. Instead of the ashes of an ostrich egg, you need to carry the barley corn that would be found in donkey dung. Carry that with you instead. Then that'd heal you. And if all else fails, you could try drinking wine with onions in it. And it's no wonder this woman was only growing worse. And I was kind of laughing as I was reading these snippets out of the Talmud about this. And I'm like, my wife would be doomed. She's not going to handle donkey dung. She hates onions. I don't know what she'd do. But she hears about something. Verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. She had heard about Jesus. Now, the easy question would be, well, what had she heard? I imagine she heard about his healing powers. What all he could do, what he was doing, how paralytics were walking, how the dead was being raised, demons cast out. But really, it's not giving us enough of the answer. It wasn't just that she heard it, she believed it. And so she's trying to get to Jesus. She wants to come up behind him. So I want you to understand something, because we read this and gloss over this. This woman is amazing. She is quickly becoming one of my favorite people that Jesus interacts with. She didn't just go to Jesus. Don't make it that simple. She went to Jesus. No. She violated the very boundaries of the law to go to Jesus. She pushed her way through the crowd, knowing what it meant if she was caught. In the whole process, every time she pushed past somebody, she ceremonially defiled that person because she was unclean. This isn't a simple statement that Mark makes here, that she went to Jesus. Now, she doesn't want to be noticed, of course. That's her goal there, because she doesn't want public shame. Her goal was if she could touch his cloak, and Luke says, he gives us a little more detail, he says it wasn't even his cloak. If she could touch the fringe of his cloak, then she knew she'd be healed. Now, if you read Numbers 15, the Jews, they'd put tassels on the bottom of their cloaks as a marking for those who believed in God. If you were a God-fearing person, you'd have those tassels. Now, Pharisees being Pharisees, you can imagine what they did with their tassels, how big and long and flashy they got. But all she wants to do is just grab the bottom fringe. In fact, that's what the word actually means. She wants to seize and take hold of that fringe. That's faith right there. The stories she heard were right. Jesus was healing all that came to him. That's the power that Jesus has. And it's going to be the same for this woman when you look at verse 29. She does it. She makes her way up to Jesus, grabs the fringe of his cloak, and verse 29 says, immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up. Immediately. And she felt it in her body that she was healed of the affliction. If you're watching this in like a movie setting, this is the moment where the camera kind of freezes. And everything slows down except for her. And you kind of get that time stand still moment. The woman knew immediately she was healed. She felt it in her body, the blood dried up. That's a powerful fringe. But the question for you is, how many other people had bumped into Jesus? How many other people had touched his cloak with nothing being recorded? He was constantly in crowds. He was constantly being touched. And yet it's this woman that is healed immediately, almost as if it's like a complete surprise that it happens. Almost being the key word. You'll see why I say that here in just a moment. But the great news is, the physical issue has now been dealt with. And if she just were to fade away into the crowd, the physical issue would have been the only thing dealt with. The woman couldn't just return to normal life. There's still a social issue she'd have to deal with, and that doesn't even address the spiritual issue. But now she has another issue. Verse 30. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" This is an incredible revelation here, by the way. She's healed instantly, but at the same time, instantly, Jesus felt power go out of him. To him, it's very personal. His power is personal. She knew it, he knew it, and yet no dialogue is taking place. She knows what happened, and yet she hasn't said a word. He knows what's happened, and all he's done now is he's saying, well, who touched me? But with this woman specifically, even though she was healed, that there's still more work to do in this regard. But when I hear this, I can't help but wonder, do you think all of this is coincidence? That Jesus just stops and asks the question, hey, which one of y'all did that? And be like me, I'm facing somebody grabs my jacket, turn, hey, who did it? As if I genuinely have no idea. Jesus stops and asks the questions, but he's God. He's God in the flesh, which means he should already know the answer. And not to mention, the disciples hear his question, and they think like we would think. Well, that's kind of a ridiculous question. Look at the crowd. People are everywhere. And Mark says they're thronging you. They're fully encompassing you. They're pressing in on you. And the word he actually uses for thronging means crushing. They are crushing you. And you're asking who touched you? Everybody. See, there's more than meets the eye with the question. That question was really for the woman. The whole interaction is really about this woman. And so I want you to notice verse 32. There's an interesting word in verse 32. And he looked around to see who randomly had done this thing. He looked around to see her who had done this thing. Jesus is looking for her. Jesus asked the question, already knowing the answer. Which also means that the woman, by the way, she didn't just kind of sit tight at the feet of Jesus when she grabbed the tassel, because she's healed immediately, and then what do you do? I imagine her goal is to fade away into the crowd without ever being noticed, fade away into her new life, certainly not be called out in the middle of this crowd. Does that sound like something any of you want to have done? You're in this huge pressing crowd, and you walk up to them and just start calling somebody out. Like imagine everyone's sitting here and everybody's there and goes, "Stephen!" And I call him out in front of everybody. Nobody would want to be called out like that. So she's trying to fade away. And Luke adds that the crowd immediately began denying it. Oh, it wasn't me. I didn't touch you. It wasn't me. Imagine her surprise to know that Jesus knew the very moment that she touched him. The very moment that power went out. Now don't forget, there is still an interesting aspect to this, that while all this is happening, Jairus is still standing there. Jairus is anxiously trying to get Jesus to his house. There's two separate dynamics unfolding here. She wants to be healed. Jairus wants his daughter healed, and Jesus just kind of stops. Stops in the middle. Why is he stopping? Why is he worried about this woman? And yet things with the Lord are never a coincidence. They are right where they are supposed to be in that very moment. But then you get something interesting. Verse 33. I want you to notice her response to the fact that Jesus knew this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Here's a question for you. Why is she fearing and trembling? Maybe it's this. Do you think she's fearing and trembling for fear of embarrassment? It's kind of hard for men, us to understand, but imagine women. I'm sure y'all can. Imagine this being you, and now you're in the middle of the crowd and you're being called out. Would you not be embarrassed? I would be. Is it the fear of the crowd? Just keep in mind, she touched all of them, trying to make her way through the crowd, which has ceremonial implications now to every person she touched. You see, it's not any of those. This is the fear of the Lord, not the fear of her offense. See, she's fully aware of what happened to her, how she was healed instantly from touching Jesus, which means she's now fully aware that all the stories that she had heard are true, which means now she's fully aware of exactly what Mark has been trying to get his audience to understand from the very beginning when he announced who Jesus was. Jesus is the Son of God. How else could this power be? Her fear is not embarrassment. Her fear is being in the presence of the Lord. The woman fearing and trembling, notice that next part, knowing what happened to her. What did she know? She knew she was healed immediately. See, this fear is very specific. This is the Isaiah, Ezekiel kind of fear right here. In fact, we talked about this in chapter 4, if you can remember back that far, where Jesus was in a boat. They're crossing over the sea, him and the apostles. And that's when the storm comes up and Jesus is asleep. And you remember that the Bible tells us specifically in that account that the apostles were afraid. They were genuinely afraid of the storm. When they wake up Jesus gets up, he rebukes the sea. The sea stops, it's as calm as glass. And then what was the response of the apostles? Then they were exceedingly afraid. Then they were really afraid. That's the fear and intimidation of being in the presence of the Lord. So she comes to the Lord once again. She falls on the ground before him. And everyone knew what that meant, especially since Jews didn't bow to people. Jews don't do that. They bow to God. You don't bow to people. And Mark says she told him the whole truth, her whole story, the confession of her sickness, the confession of her faith, the confession of her healing. And Luke says everyone heard the story. There are no more secrets anymore. But the greatest thing that will be heard is Jesus' response to her. This response right here deserves in itself a lot of time and attention. We're going to give it some. But it's a powerful verse. Verse 34, and he, that's Jesus, said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." Daughter. Really? Really? She snuck up behind you and touched you without you knowing it. Without you authorizing it. She ceremonially, I can't get that word out today, ceremonially defiled every person in the crowd. Daughter? You talk about a single word that should remove every ounce of fear from this woman. It's interesting to note, by the way, that this is the only time in the New Testament that a woman is addressed by Jesus this way, daughter. Be of good comfort, daughter. Now the question is, how could Jesus call her daughter? Is she a child of God in the way that we would think of today as a Christian? Jesus says, your faith has made you well. Now, I try to limit how much I dive into Greek. I know how much Marshall likes that when we get into the Greek. I try not to do too much. The Greek word here is sozo. S-O-Z-O, if you're going to spell it. Sozo. Which is the word we use for salvation. Saved. What Jesus literally just said is, your faith saved you. He takes all thought away from some magical fringe on a cloak, some coincidental event that unfolds. It was her faith. That's what separated her from every other person that was bumping into Jesus and touching Jesus. He says, daughter, your faith has saved you. And it's interesting, by the way, that Mark, he doesn't use the word for healing here. He uses it at the end of the verse. The word was available. The word could have easily been used. He knew it, he has it, and he does it. He says, your faith sozo. Your faith saved you. Now, does it sound like there's more in mind here than the issue of blood? You see, the Gospels tell us many times that Jesus healed people with no faith. There wasn't a predication on faith when Jesus was healing people. He healed people with faith. Yet no person was ever saved without faith. When the Lord calls her daughter, that's the call to a child of God. Not to mention this, and that's why I say this verse is so deserving of its own study. You notice that phrase where he tells her here, towards the end of that verse? Go in peace. Jesus does not throw that phrase around. In fact, you'll notice he only says that phrase a couple of times. Because there is no peace unless you're first at peace with God. So this is a phrase he takes very seriously. He doesn't throw it away, throw it around very often. But that's what this woman has done. She's made her peace with God. She knew she was a sinner. She knew she was in need. She knew there was nothing that could be done about it. Because like most people do, she exhausted every option. And yet she come to learn the greatest truth of all. What she needed from the very beginning was Jesus. She needed the Lord. And her faith in Jesus is what led her to act. That's what saved her. So when you read this account, it's an amazing account. The miracle within the miracle. You learn so many important aspects between her and Jairus. Just high-level things. The Lord is open and accessible, that He cares about us to this level. But remember what He's trying to do. He's trying to preach. Miracles were just there to affirm His message. He's trying to preach. He already stopped preaching to go with Jairus. He's now stopped in process going with Jairus to help this woman. But in this woman, and really in Jairus as well, you're kind of brought to this question. Where do you turn in your own times of need? Or when you're struggling and you're hurting and there's sickness and there's pain. And listen, don't take that question to mean I'm advocating, hey, don't go to any doctors. I'm not advocating that. Doctor, I got to cancel my appointment. My preacher said I couldn't come see you. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we need to remember the great physician. who makes himself open and available to all of those who believe. That's the blessing that it is. And we see that with Jesus, when all these people would come to him. But coming to him in faith is a statement that he then makes to her. Daughter, your faith has saved you. Because your faith saved you, go in peace. Go in peace, because by your faith, you're now at peace with God. And that's what this is really about. What a blessing that is. Now, my hope is that this is a blessing that as a Christian you are experiencing today. If it's not, Brother Dupree is going to lead us in the invitation song here in just a moment. And I would encourage you to reflect upon the message. More so than that, reflect upon Jesus' statement to her. The power, the implication, the call, everything in what he tells her by her faith. And if you're one here this afternoon and you're struggling with whatever it may be, we're all going through different things. And as a family, I like to believe that we know some of the struggles you're going through, but a lot of times we don't. And so if you're one that's in need in any way, if you need the prayers of the congregation, maybe you're ready to answer the call of the gospel. Whatever that need may be, I want to encourage you to come as we stand and we sing this invitation song.
Hear the sweet voice of Jesus say, come unto me, I am the way. Hearken the loving call away. It's what he loves to show. Only a step, come for he bled for you and I. He's the same loving Savior yet, Jesus the crucified. Casting your heavy burdens down, come to the cross, the world may frown, yet you shall wear a glorious crown when he makes us his own. Only a step, come for he bled for you and I. He's the same loving Savior yet, Jesus the crucified.